Okay, next we are going to hear from Barbara Wright. She is going to be speaking to us on FDA's Bioresearch monitoring program, specifically about foreign inspections and program updates. So, Barbara?
Thank you. Appreciate the invitation to address you today. It's been a very exciting 2 years at FDA. We've had a lot of changes in our program, in the field organization, and in the bioresearch monitoring program specifically. So I'd like to talk to you about those today. Sorry. Am I? Yeah, it's not. Okay, I'm technically challenged here. There it is, whoops. Okay, I guess I have to push harder. So I'd like to talk to you about the changes in the field organization at FDA and why some of those came about, and then some of the changes in the bioresearch monitoring program. As the foreign Cadre supervisor, I've been asked to talk to you today about our foreign inspection program, what we cover, our accomplishments this year. And then lastly, I'd like to close today with kind of a summary of our most common inspection type, which is clinical investigators, and maybe give you some tips and tricks for surviving an FDA audit of a clinical investigator site. So let's get started. So you may or may not know that over the course of FDA's history, the field inspections have been done by a team of generalist investigators for the most part, with some specialists, and to handle the diverse workload that we have. And as you can imagine, for an agency that started out regulating drugs and foods, and over time we've evolved to pick up medical devices, human tissues, now tobacco, and with the evolution of technology in the industry, the product testing has evolved, manufacturing methods have evolved. Our field inspections have gotten increasingly more diverse and increasingly more complicated over time. So that's led the field to move from generalist investigators who inspect everything within the scope of our purview to generalists who do maybe 2 or 3 different commodity types of inspections, and specialists who handle the larger, more complex inspection types. Well, in 2017, we underwent a major reorganization in the Office of Regulatory Affairs, which is the field force, the field inspection force. And we shifted from a geographic alignment of our districts to a program-directed alignment of our districts. So now we have drugs handled by the pharmaceutical division, medical devices by a medical device team, and in the office, and then the formation of the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring, our team of investigators handles all of the research inspections. So as a practical matter, we went from a field team of about 1,000 investigators with a diversity of experience and challenges and work plan obligations to a team of about 100 for our program. We went from about 20 districts and 7 regions to 2 districts, 2 divisions in our program. So that, as you can see from this chart, we've divided our domestic workload into these 2 divisions. There's a roughly even separation of our inventory among even though, geographically it's not the same size. Our inventory of firms is about an even split among these 2 divisions. So we have a management structure for the Bioresearch Monitoring East Division and a management structure for the Bioresearch Monitoring West Division. So what does that mean? It means that you have 100 different investigators going out and doing our 1,400 inspections a year, and those inspections get funneled through no more than 2 different supervisory chains of command before they get back to the center. So what it does for us as a field organization is it improves our communications with the centers. In the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations, we have interactions with all of the centers in FDA. We do inspections for the Center for Drugs, Center for Medical Devices and Radiological Health, Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, Center for Tobacco Products. I think I have everybody. Everything in FDA. Our commodity is data. It's research data. Having this structure where we have bioresearch monitoring trained investigators reporting to supervisors who only review and assign BIMO work, to our division management who only work in the BIMO program, improves the communications with the centers, improves our efficiency. It allows us to be able to target our training efforts for investigators to those particular needs of that program. Now, our program in and of itself has a lot of diversity in it, but being able to go from multiple commodities to our one clinical research commodity is a huge benefit to the field organization. As I said, it allows us to focus our training efforts, to focus our inspection efforts. As a practical matter, if you're a generalist working in a one-man resident post, it means no more months of going from a chemical plant to a crab meat processor to a clinical investigator. And that's huge, right? So from tissue to testing facilities, there's a shift, and there's an inefficiency when you make that shift. So this change in our field organization has made us more efficient, made us more effective, and it made our lives easier from my perspective as a field investigator for how we manage our workload. So the second recent change in our program has happened a year ago this week, essentially. BIMO set up a dedicated foreign inspection cadre. We took 8 of the investigators from the domestic divisions and assigned them exclusively to international inspections. They maintain their office wherever they came from. So we have people from coast to coast, from California to Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Missouri, our investigators, and Texas. We have one in Texas. So our team of dedicated foreign inspectors, they work 18 weeks out of the year doing foreign inspections in 2 to 4 week intervals. They sign up for a 1-year commitment as a detail to this team, and they can renew and stay on the foreign inspection team and continue to work on that workload. For the program as a whole, we complete 1,400 inspections a year, roughly. 1,100 of those are domestic inspections, and 300 of those are foreign inspections. Having a dedicated team that has all of the training, all of the travel documentation, and weeks of consecutive availability set up in advance allows us to work more efficiently at that foreign work plan and to get our work done faster and in compliance with our user fee deadlines. So the team is made up of a diverse group of talents so that they can handle the diversity of the workload that we have. And they obviously, they love travel. They have flown 100,000 miles roughly each this year, and they started one year ago this week. So they're very busy people. They've accomplished 40% of our foreign work plan. Now, historically, the agency has conducted foreign inspections with several different contributors. So we have foreign offices around the world. So we have investigators assigned to our China office and to our India office, and they contribute to the foreign work plan. We have domestic investigators who volunteer to take foreign trips, and historically that's the way we've addressed the foreign work plan, is that investigators assigned to domestic work would volunteer to take a 2-week or 3-week trip to do foreign inspections. We also have subject matter experts that come from the center, and they handle some of our inspections as well. And we have a team of national and program experts that contribute. So this year, 40% of that 300 inspection workload was done by this dedicated team, which is a little bit more than the domestic investigators did. Keep hitting the wrong button, sorry y'all. But our center folks the center subject matter experts conducted about 35 of the 300 inspections in this fiscal year. 120 of them were done by the Cadre, about 115 by our domestic investigators, and the rest were subject matter experts and national and program experts in our programs. So if you're curious about the kinds of inspections that we do internationally, the majority, it looks a lot like our domestic work plan. The majority of our inspections are clinical investigator inspections, but there's a considerable number of bioequivalence, analytical inspections, sponsors, contract research organizations, and monitors make up a small percentage. The GLP, good laboratory practice, or non-clinical labs, we do some of those inspections. And our pharmacovigilance program, the paid program, also represents a small number of inspections in our foreign work plan. The big difference between foreign inspections and domestic inspections is that you don't see institutional review boards or ethics committees here. Those we would not do outside of the U.S. But that's the primary difference. The breakdown is a little bit different, but that's the big difference in the types of assignments that we do. So the how, where, and why. Why would FDA do inspections, conduct inspections outside of the United States? Well, first, the where. If you see this color-coded chart here, the most frequently visited country for our work is India. A full 1/3 of our work plan takes place in India. And so it's largely generic drug inspections, related inspections in India. So that's 100 roughly of our 300 inspections that we do. The next most frequently visited country are our friends to the north, Canada, with about 25 inspections a year. Then Poland, rising in the ranks at about 20 inspections a year. And then the other Western European countries, France, Germany, the UK, Spain, we do about a dozen inspections there per year. And then the others that you see on this map are single-digit numbers for the year. So why do we do inspections outside of the U.S.? Primarily because ours is an application-driven program. And when new medical products come to the agency for approval, the decision to inspect a site is driven by the data itself. In current clinical research, most trials are international trials, or a large number of the trials are international trials. And so when we go to select the site based on risk factors, it's based on risk factors. It's not based on whether it's convenient because I have an investigator who's living in that city. It's based on risk factors. So if the data is being driven by a population at a site in Eastern Europe, then that site is probably going to be selected because they're either a high enroller or they have some data variance, what have you. But the location of the data is not going to be the major determining factor in site selection. So if it's key to the ability to accept the statistical conclusions that are drawn from the application, then that site's going to be one of the ones that we would pick for selection. So the process of how we do foreign inspections, really not that different from domestic. I don't know how many people here have been inspected by FDA. If you haven't, or maybe even if you have, you might be wondering, how do we pick your site? How do we pick any site? How does a site get notified before the FDA investigator shows up? What should the site do before the investigator shows up? What's going to happen once FDA is at your site for an inspection? And then what happens after? What kind of paperwork follows? Because the government, there has to be paperwork that follows. Lots and lots of paperwork. So the site selections, depending on the different types of inspections, some of our inspections are surveillance-based inspections. So our pharmacovigilance program, the post-marketing adverse drug experience reporting program, those inspection assignments are going to be driven by the inspection history of the firm, the number of products in their portfolio, maybe any signals that they might not be in compliance, such as complaints or late reports, whether they've been inspected before and had a good inspection, or not, or whether they've never been inspected before. So all of those factors are going to be considered in any kind of surveillance-based inspection assignment. The majority of our assignments, I think 99.5 of the foreign inspections we did last year were application-driven assignments. So in these inspections, the decision to select a site is going to be driven by the pivotal studies that come in the application and whether those sites are key sources of data for the application. Are they driving the approval process? Are they high enrollers? Do they have a large number of adverse events? Do they have a small number of adverse events? Do they have better efficacy data, or do they show less efficacy at that site? Those data outliers, those high enrollers, those any of the sites whose data might affect the decision to approve or disapprove the application, the more weight they have in that process, the more likely those sites are going to be the ones that we obviously are going to want to inspect. We can't inspect every site on every study. So the way that we manage our resources is to let the risk factors decide. So the risk factors are going to be associated with those things. So with the domestic inspections, if you've ever been inspected, you probably hopefully you got a courtesy call from the investigator a few days before they showed up to audit your study. It is a courtesy call to let you know that we're coming, not so much a negotiation. So if I called a site and I'd say, I have an inspection assignment to come audit this study, I'll be there, I'd like to be there Monday, and can we get started at 8 o'clock? If the site said, well, Monday's not good for me, and said, well, I can come tomorrow, that works for me too. And the site says, tomorrow's not good for me, and I said, so how's next week again? And they said, well, next week is Nurses Week. I will bring a cake, but I will come on Monday. Is 8 or 9 o'clock your preference? So it's a courtesy call. And the problem with negotiating an inspection date is that we don't have a whole lot of time to get the inspections done before the review process has to take place. So we like to get them scheduled as quickly as possible. And we like to get them conducted and get out of your clinic as quickly as possible as well. So we do place a courtesy call, schedule that inspection if your site has an issue, a real conflict. If your investigator is scheduled to be a speaker at a SOCRA event that week, then please tell us. We have a little bit of flexibility, and if your child's tonsils are being removed, then please tell us, because we can push the inspection off a little bit. But we do, reach out and inform the site that we're coming normally. For foreign inspections, it's much more complicated. There's a lot that goes into planning these foreign trips. The State Department is involved. There are lots of groups within FDA that are involved in that process. So it takes weeks to plan a foreign site for inspection. So we usually reach out in an email and ask and identify the study that's going to be inspected. And this is typically, we identify the type of inspection. So it could be a good clinical practice inspection, BEQ, GLP, or pharmacovigilance. So we'll identify the study type. If it's an investigator site, we'll identify the study that we're looking to inspect, set up the inspection dates, talk about the types of records that need to be available, and work on some of the other logistics for the inspection, like if the records aren't in English, how are we going to know what they say? So we like to get some help with setting up a translator for those sites. So if the site gets pre-inspection notification, the first thing we ask them to do is to respond to that email or respond to the courtesy call and let us know that you're going to have the key personnel available for us, the data that we're going to need to audit. We like when the site can arrange for a nice space for us to work in, but the regulations don't say how nice it has to be. So it could be a broom closet with a chair and a folding chair and a TV tray table. But if you have an extra office or a conference room, then that's helpful to get us getting through the records more quickly. As I said, we like to have key staff members who worked on the study available for questions, not necessarily from 8 a.m. to 4:30 in the afternoon, but available to pop in and answer some questions as we go through the records. Any logistical needs that have to be addressed, we like to get those worked out as quickly as possible before the inspection happens. And then if the records are stored off-site, we'd ask that you retrieve those records and have them available for us. Again, whether it's foreign or domestic, our on-site approach is the same. There's an investigator operations manual that's available on the internet that talks about how FDA does inspections and everything else that we do. But our inspections generally start out with an opening meeting. We lay out the purpose and the scope of the inspection and talk about some of the logistics, maybe the daily summaries, the availability of staff, the office hours, anything that we're going to need to proceed with the inspection while we're on site. After that opening meeting, for domestic inspections, during the opening meeting, the investigator will show credentials and issue a written notice of inspection, an FDA 482, letting the site know that we're there to do an inspection. For foreign inspections, we just show our credentials, usually provide a business card, but the written notice form is not required for those. Then the next stage is the inspection itself. I call it a compliance review, data audit, facility assessments. That when the FDA investigator is on site to do an inspection, he or she is going to want to look at all of the, they're going to want to walk through the facility and make sure that any of the needs of the protocol can be met by the facility. So if there's a particular piece of equipment that's going to be required in order to meet some element of the inspection protocol, then we're going to look for that piece of equipment to be available and maintained properly. Most of the inspection is not a facility review. Most of the inspection is actually looking at the papers, right? Looking at the study records. All of the records need to be available to the investigator. We're not going to look at all of the records. We can't possibly in the number of days that we have there unless it's a small study, but all of the records need to be verified as available for inspection. And then the FDA inspector will select from that sample, from the totality, a sample for audit. And then at the end of any inspection, there's always going to be some kind of a summary meeting or a closing meeting. And at this time, hopefully, any objectionable conditions or concerns that the auditor had when going through the site, hopefully they've already been discussed over the course of the inspection. But this is a time to wrap that up, talk about the concerns with either the data or human subject protection or anything that the inspector or FDA investigator believes is not in compliance with federal regulations. This is going to be covered in a summary meeting, and if it rises to the level of a violation of the minimum standard, y'all have heard that twice this morning, FDA regulations are the minimum standard. Federal regulations are a minimum standard. So anything that's believed to violate a minimum standard would be issued in writing at the closing meeting. And the inspector would hope that there would be some kind of corrective action or response to those findings at that time. So the different types of inspections that we would conduct under the Bioresearch monitoring program are, as I said, the clinical investigator sites, which we're looking for compliance with good clinical practices, which internationally is ICH E6 is kind of the best guidance document out, that the agency recognizes that speaks to those good clinical practices. But also, we're looking for compliance with human subject protection regulations. And human subject protection standards in those reviews. We inspect biopharmaceutical laboratories for bioavailability, bioequivalence. We inspect non-clinical laboratories for compliance with good laboratory practice regulations in Part 58 under 21 CFR. And then our pharmacovigilance program is the other type of inspection that we're doing domestically and internationally. So at the end of any FDA inspection, after that closing meeting, the investigator will go back to the office and write a narrative inspection report. So that FDA 483, if there's one issued, the list of inspectional observations, if that's issued, that's not the end all for the inspection. That is just a summary of the concerns. Our policies and procedures, which you can find in our compliance programs, they lay out what we're expected to cover in an inspection report. And we describe the scope and the purpose of the inspection. We describe what we look at. We describe what's in compliance or what we're concerned about. And if there are objectionable findings listed in that closing discussion, we go into some details about that closing meeting and any responses that we get. So that's called the Establishment Inspection Report, the EIR. And that narrative report gets routed through that dedicated BIMO supervisor through the dedicated branch director in one of those two divisions and up to the center that issued the inspection assignment. We would encourage anyone who gets inspected by FDA and receives a 483 to send a written response to those observations. As I mentioned, during the closing discussion, hopefully it's a dialogue and not just a monologue with the investigator, FDA investigator sitting there saying, okay, this is what I found wrong. Hopefully the site will explain those deficiencies or will address them, will propose some kind of corrective action, and that will be in the inspection report. But if there is a 483, we encourage the sites to respond within 15 business days. That way, the person in the center that wrote the inspection assignment and issued it, they have the full narrative inspection report from the investigator, and then they have the 483 response from the firm. They can look at that in its totality before they reach conclusions about whether an enforcement action is appropriate for the inspection. So is the written response to the 483 required? No. But a birthday card to your spouse or mother is not required either. So just saying. That's my first advice for you today. So I'd like to get into a little bit more. I've talked a lot about clinical investigator inspections and talking about our process, but I like to kind of recap what we're looking for on our inspections. Most of it is laid out in a compliance program, 7348.811, if you want to search the internet for that. And it lays out that we should cover the facilities and equipment, the subject case histories, communications with the sponsor and the ethics committee, how the test article was accounted for and used, and any delegations of authority to the staff, whether they were qualified. So I'd like to say, when we come to do an inspection, it's usually years after the study. So I would encourage the sites, when you're thinking about how to set up your study documentation, your source documentation, think about, can it stand the test of time? And I'm not just talking about if it's paper, if it's on thermal paper, or if it's electronic, if you've got a backup for that system and you're going to maintain the legacy software to be able to read that. That's important. But also, 8 years from now, if your entire study staff is gone, will the records tell the story? We're not there to see the study. We can't observe the study when we do an inspection. So we're totally dependent on being able to reconstruct that study from the written records. So do the records stand on their own? Can we reconstruct the entire study from the records, the source documentation that you've maintained on your trial? 2 years later, 10 years later, was all the data complete? All the originals, not just the radiologist's interpretation of the x-ray, but the x-ray film itself. Were all of the original records maintained and protected? Did the investigator delegate tasks? And if he did he delegate tasks to people who met the qualifications to perform those tasks? Can we see that in the study record? Were the right subjects enrolled? By this, I mean, did you have all of the screening data before you randomized the subject? Not just the stuff that was convenient, but if the patient was not previously known to the investigator, did you reach out for a copy of the medical history from their primary care physician to support that they met all of the eligibility criteria? Did you wait for the clinical labs to come back to make sure that they met all of the criteria in the eligibility checklist, not just the stuff you can assess on that first day? So did you end up with the right subjects? Did they get dosed and treated according to the protocol? If their weight went up and down, was the dose titrated up and down when it was supposed to be? If they had clinical signs and symptoms or clinical labs that met a titration rule or a stopping rule, did your site respond to that data? Did they act in accordance with the study protocol? And what evidence do we have that the subjects met the criteria, that they received the treatment they were supposed to see, that all the handling and storage conditions for the test article were met from the point of receipt until the end of the trial? These are the questions, if you can answer before we arrive, then everybody's happy. So when we reconstruct this study, we're looking to make sure that all of the study interventions dictated in the protocol, all of the assessments in the protocol were done in accordance with the investigational plan. Will we look at all of them? It's going to depend on the study. We'll be selective. We'll look at the highest risk factors first, right? But we're looking to make an assessment of compliance with the investigational plan. And by the investigational plan, I would say not just the protocol and any supporting documents that explain what the total plan is. So that could include a lab manual. It could include a slide deck from training session. So anything in the investigational plan we're looking for compliance with. Now, does any FDA investigator expect to go to a perfect site that has no deviations? No out-of-window subject visits? If I do, it's a work of fiction. That's my personal opinion, but people are people, right? Study subjects are people, unless we're doing animal research. So people have lives, people have complications, people get flat tires, people wake up with a migraine headache and don't want to get in a car and drive to see a study doctor. People have complications, life happens. So we don't expect a perfect trial. We expect people to forget to do things. What we're looking for is, do those deviations matter to the interpretation of the study outcomes? Are they so significant in their nature? Are they so significant in their number that it weakens our ability to draw conclusions from the data set? That's our mission as field investigators, to try to determine. If we have concerns about that, we write about it in that EIR, we send it to the medical officers in the center, and they make the final call as to whether it makes a big difference to the conclusions that can be drawn or not. But that's where we're looking at. So we're looking at, did you execute the study at your site in a way that set yourself up for success or failure? Did you design your source documents to capture everything that was critical in that study and capture each of the persons who worked on all of those critical steps? Did you set up the study subject visits at the beginning of the window so that if they missed that date, maybe you could get them in before the end of that assessment window? Did you have the resources to comply with what the protocol was asking you to do? Or was it just a poorly managed trial? So that's kind of the execution part of it, to the do part, right? And then there's the document part. As I said, we don't get to see the study. It's over before we get there, for the most part. Occasionally we do some in-life studies, but most of the time we're going years after a trial's been completed. So we're totally dependent on those records, and we're looking for a way to build confidence in what the records are telling us happened with the study. We've got a list of Excel spreadsheets from the data line listings from the application that we're trying to verify against an original record. Okay, so we're looking to see, did that study data get accurately and completely reported to the sponsor and then to FDA? Or is there a conflict between my line listings that came with my assignment and what the subject's record is telling me? Do the record-keeping practices meet the Alcoa standard? Can we attribute all of the entries to someone at the site? Do we know who recorded the data? Is it legible? And by legible, again, we're talking about not just handwriting, but thermal paper and audit trails on electronic records and legacy systems maintained to access old software systems. Was it contemporaneously recorded, or were there some late entries in the record, and how many late entries in the record, and how late were those entries in the record? If you tell me that you dosed the patient, you have an entry for the patient's dosing at a certain time, 8 a.m., and 4 months later that time is changed to 8:10 a.m., that makes no sense to me. I'm looking for logical entries in the record, contemporaneously recorded data. So if there's a change after that event, there ought to be some kind of explanation. There ought to be some kind of justification for making that change. Oh, I recorded the wrong, I don't know what the explanation could be for that. 4 months later, you would change the time by 10 minutes. But I've seen that, and it just leaves you scratching your head. I can't trust this data point. And if I can't trust this data point, how many other data points can I not trust, right? So I want to say, I believe your data because I can make the connections between data that should agree, agrees. Data that doesn't agree, that shouldn't agree, doesn't agree, right? Original, as I said, original and complete. So all of the records need to be maintained, not just summary documents, not just photocopies of documents. It needs to be the original record that we reconstruct from. For any trial, the most important steps are going to be eligibility and the endpoint data. For me as an auditor, right, that's where I'm going to focus, because if you didn't put the right subject in the trial, nothing else you did right matters. If you didn't dose the subject right, nothing else you did right matters. If you didn't assess the subject in the right time window, then, is there a way to adjust for that, to account for that? To still build confidence in the conclusions that we're drawing from the database when it's outside the window. So, I refer to some of the key steps on a study as the measure twice, cut once. If you've ever used a saw or a pair of scissors, you've probably heard that expression. These things can't be undone. Once you miss a window for a safety assessment, you've missed the window. Once you missed a window for an efficacy assessment, you've missed the window. Does it matter? Depends on the study. Depends on the point that you're looking at. Once you put the wrong subject in the study, then no conclusions can really be drawn from that. So these are the points where I would say, if you have the resources to add a layer of confidence to your data, if you can add a second person, this is a personal opinion, but if you can do QC checks at your most critical data points, then it adds value to your study. It adds value and confidence to your data. During the inspection, FDA is also going to look for executed statement of investigator forms. A lot of investigators sign this form and I think probably don't read a whole lot into what's on the back of the second page of the 1572. There's a lot of fine print there. Among that is, I've read the investigator's brochure, and I'm aware of all the risks. That's no small task, especially when there's new volume that comes out all the time. I agree to conduct a study using an IRB that's compliant with Part 56. Well, if an investigator sends a change in the study protocol, let's say increases risks to the study subjects, sends that change to the IRB, and the IRB expedites the approval of that change with a significant risk, the investigator should say, wait a minute, that's not in compliance with Part 56. I'm going to go back and recommend a full board review of that change, right? Because it doesn't meet expedited review. So we look for the 1572 or the investigator agreement on device studies to be in place and to be in compliance. If you've looked at warning letters I looked at warning letters in the last 5 years, and one of the things that struck me is that most of the failure to follow the investigational plan observations in the warning letter were also, and you failed to protect the subjects in the trial. It's important to obtain informed consent from the study subject. The presentation this morning was terrific because the informed consent process, we all know, can be very complicated, as can the forms. And you have to ask yourself, is it legally effective informed consent if I hand a 42 typed page narrative consent form to a terminally ill patient and give them an hour to read it and sign it? We have to stop and ask these questions about what does informed consent really mean. We'll do that on an inspection. We'll look at that process. We'll look at the content of those forms to make sure they contain the basic elements and none of the objectionable language. as specified by the regulations. But any special protections asked for by the IRB, whether it's a witness or translations, any of those special conditions will look for compliance with the IRB's specified requirements. So again, getting back to when the protocol violation is also a human subject protection violation, dose titration and stopping rules, safety assessments not done or not done in the window, not looking at adverse events and monitoring the subject's progress on the trial as indicated by the protocol. Those are all human subject protection issues. And then, back to, then at the end of the inspection, as I mentioned a couple of times, you've got this closing discussion with the FDA inspector. It's an opportunity to get clarity on any concerns. It's an opportunity to discuss any of the observations on the 43 and what you plan to do to prevent those from occurring on future trials or to correct anything that you might be able to correct at that point in time. The investigator will take those findings, take that summary, write that narrative inspection report, and send that through the supervisor to the Center for Drugs or Devices or whoever issued the assignment. And again, back to that birthday card. You might want to send a letter if you got a 483. It's your option, but I recommend it. And I think that's it. Thank you.